the early European settlers to New Zealand were in for a shock. Coming from places where industry and invention were constantly moving forwards, this wild and isolated land was a world away from anything they knew. The work was hard and the money was tight, but slowly and surely, resourceful New Zealanders laid the foundations for the nation we live in today. This series follows the building of New Zealand roads, railways, power stations and ports, celebrating the vision and effort that made a country. This is the nerve centre of Auckland roads, controlling the motorways and main routes with the most traffic and the worst congestion in the country. New Zealand roads have come a long way. The first ones are bone-rattling, but the drive onwards never stops.
For the road maker, this land of ours gives both opportunity and challenge.
We build modern marvels in extreme conditions and bridge a city with nerves of steel. Nothing stands in the road maker's way.
Boss gives you a shovel and a pick and says, well, just start digging through the bottom of that hill.
This is the role of roads in making New Zealand.
In 1839-40, when New Zealand was set up as a British colony, the Maori had a complete society already. It was well organised and fully established across the country. The British came in with huge ambitions of their own. And of course the roading and the bridging and the tunnels and the railways and all the rest of these things were very much a part of that. When the Pākehā arrived in New Zealand, Maori had many tracks and pathways and ways of getting from place to place. But there was nothing that the Pākehā felt that they could use particularly as a road for heavy traffic. They had bullock wagons, they had carts, eventually they had stagecoaches. They followed the Maori in that they used the rivers quite often, but eventually roads started appearing.
The first roads were short, mainly linking settlements to the early ports on harbours and rivers. Roads in the towns were just dirt. After rain, mud. Overland travel on foot or horseback was difficult and time-consuming. Coastal travel by sea was unreliable and too often treacherous. With no effective transport and communications, colonial New Zealand developed as separate provinces, isolated, self-governing, parochial and small-time.
Most of the public works were administered from local centres, and this limited the scope of what could be done because the province couldn't borrow a lot of money by comparison with central government. And inevitably anything that happened was accompanied by gigantic argument. The biggest impetus for roading came with the New Zealand Wars and the need for the British military to move large numbers of people and equipment around the country. For example, the Great South Road was set up specifically as a military supply route, and George Grey, the governor, rather cleverly was able to offload the cost of it onto the British Army by getting the soldiers to make it. And they didn't like it. They felt that they were being treated like convicts.
Early sheep farming survived in wild and isolated places, but the dairy boom in the late 19th century needed better roading to get produce to market. The new roads were passable for horse and cart, but not so much for the new engine-powered vehicles.
So they'd be driving along these colonial age roads, cart roads and tracks and so forth, bogging all the way. They just could not get out of the mud. That really put a lot of pressure on the government, a lot of pressure on local roads boards who were administering these things to improve the surfaces.
The building of many early roads was motivated by gold, like the link from Canterbury to the west coast over Arthur's Pass and through the fearsome Otira Gorge. When gold was discovered on the coast in 1864, the only roads are from the north and south. So Nelson and Dunedin made money supplying the miners, and Christchurch missed out. The Canterbury provincial government called on surveyor and explorer Arthur Dobson to find the pass known to be used by Māori.
Arthur eventually got to the top of Arthur's Pass, but once he looked down into the valley towards Otira, he came to the conclusion that there was no way that they were ever going to put a road through there.
But cashing in on the gold bonanza was a powerful incentive. And soon men are cutting a coach road over Arthur's Pass, through the Otira Gorge with picks and shovels, horse and cart. Conditions were appalling. The winter of 1865 was one of the worst on record.
The men who worked on the road, they worked and slept where they did the work. They had tents which they took with them as they progressed. They had no heating. They generally just had an oil lamp. The tents froze, they froze. A lot of people were killed. There was a lot of dynamite accidents. People died with hypothermia. It just amazes me what they did, what they put up with, how they did it.
The Arthur's Pass coach road took just 10 months to build and opened in March 1866. The trip took 36 hours, barring incident, but it wasn't a journey for the faint-hearted or weak-stomached.
The particular coaches that were used had a tendency to roll, and they had a forward and backward roll. And this tended to give a sort of a motion like being seasick. And one report, a lady said that she had travelled all the way from England and hadn't been seasick, and she was seasick on the coach going to the west coast. The rivers were quite torturous. A lot of the rivers, when they flooded, would break bridges. There were times recorded when coaches got stranded between two rivers. They'd get through one river and couldn't get through to the next one because it was flooded, and they would go back through the one they'd just come through and that's flooded, and they'd have to spend maybe a day, 2 days just parked in the bush between the two rivers.
The West Coast Gold Rush ran out within a couple of years of the road opening, and although coaches still used it right up to the 1920s, it's poorly maintained. When the Otira Tunnel opened in 1923, the railway provided a much quicker and safer link.
The road deteriorated badly over the years. It got to the point where the AA were advising people not to use it. It was so bad. And the railway decided to take an opportunity, and they built some flat deck wagons. And that train took your car all the way to the West Coast. And of course that made the matter worse, and that the government said, well, there's no need to fix the road because you can take your car on the train.
In 1929, the government established Arthur's Pass National Park, recognising the area's environmental and recreational value. The scenic railway line was popular, and the roads increasingly busy too. But the section above Otira Gorge was unstable and dangerous, and it stayed that way until a great feat of engineering in the 1990s. By the turn of the 20th century, imports of petrol-driven cars and motorbikes were underway, and a local vehicle assembly industry soon followed. But there's not the same progress on the roads. The problem was council roads boards.
It all worked very well in the age of horse and cart. Nobody went very far. It was literally user pays. But suddenly somebody's, say, living in Levin, and a car turns up from Foxton. Well, Foxton's a different road board. There were complaints because road boards didn't like having to fund the cost of repairing their roads for vehicles that came from other roads boards. As a result, as New Zealand motorised, it forced central government to bring all this under better control, properly fund it, and also seal initially the main highways, later as many other roads as possible.
In the far south, the tourism potential of Milford Sound and Fiordland was recognised by the first Pākehā explorers, and it was the entrepreneurship of the early tourism operators that drove the road here.
The first Union steamships started to come into Milford in about 1878. The steamships used to bring the people in, and they'd walk up to the Sutherland Falls and view them. In the early 1890s, Quinta McKinnon come over the McKinnon Pass, that's the inland route from Te Anau, and of course the Milford Track was then funded, and that was the first overland way into Milford Sound.
But the track couldn't handle vehicles, and tourism couldn't develop without a road. Te Anau is the starting point for a planned road up the Hollyford Valley, through a tunnel in the Homer Saddle and on to Milford Sound. But the cost is out of the question, until the 1930s and the Great Depression.
When the Depression came along, it was seen as a perfect opportunity to use the labour to actually build the road from Te Anau through to Milford. In those days, there was no unemployment benefit paid, so if you were out of work, you had to take on these jobs. So a lot of men would have to leave their families behind, and a proportion of their pay was kept and sent to their families, but they still had to sustain themselves. In those days, you had to clothe yourself, you had to feed yourself, you had to pay for your coal, alcohol, etc. So at the end of the day, they didn't really have a lot left over, and if you broke a shovel handle, you got charged for it.
The workers lived in makeshift camps along the road. As the road pushed forward, the camps packed up and moved with it. Supplies came in every 3 weeks by horse or truck, and one enterprising soul even set up a hot bread shop.
This is one of the few remaining features left alongside the Milford Road, dating back to the Depression construction era. It was a baker's oven built here to supply bread to the road workers working in Upper Hollyford. The nearest stores for the road workers up here was nearly 80 miles away, so to have fresh bread daily would have been, a great comfort, really.
Terry Gilligan grew up at Mossman near Te Anau and has driven trucks on the Milford Road all his life. Terry started early in the family transport business.
My dad had a transport at Mossman, and when the road started, he got the contract to cart all the goods and services for Ministry of Works. The men that came, they were given a tent and a bed, and that was about it. There's so many of them that couldn't handle that. Some of them couldn't even boil water. They'd never been out of the town in their life.
The climate was extreme. Heavy snow and torrential rain frequently held up the job, and if the men don't work, they don't get paid. The isolation drove more than a few to drink. Only the tough survive.
They had a nucleus of men that they could trust and could work on their own. Nothing was a problem to the men of the Milford Road. They're a class of people that you don't really get now. They were workers.
Marion Camp was established as the local headquarters of the Public Works Department. From Marion, it's only 13 kilometres to the base of the Homer Saddle. The road was finished as work started on the tunnel itself.
In those days, you just imagine arriving here in this dynamic environment, and the boss gives you a shovel and a pick and says, well, just start digging through the bottom of that hill.
Deep in Fiordland in the 1930s Great Depression, the government's Public Works Department was building a road to Milford Sound. It's reached the Homer Saddle, where a tunnel is planned and a work camp grows beneath the portal. To save money, the tunnel route is the shortest through the saddle, but this puts the entrance in the middle of an avalanche zone.
When we look to the skyline, beyond that there's an awful lot of mountain and snowfield, and of course from this angle you can't really see the avalanche coming. You probably hear it, and then it would appear over those bluffs above us, and of course you'd only have a fraction of a second in the time it would reach here.
In July 1936, a man was killed and several injured when an avalanche struck the tunnel entrance. The next year, another avalanche at the same place claimed the lives of the engineer in charge and the tunnel overseer.
So they decided to build something that would protect the workers. So we're actually standing on the top of an extended portal that they built. It's protected them for a little while, but then it was blown over in another huge avalanche in 1945. Some of the remains of this portal are laid down at the entranceway of the tunnel today.
The camp was men only. There were no facilities for women or children, but the rules were changed to attract more skilled men to the project.
My mother was the first married woman who was allowed up the road. The photos that I've got of the tent with my sister standing outside, it appears to be made of timber up to about 3 to 4 feet around the outside with canvas over the top. That's the roof, and galvanised iron chimney, just bent round. One door, no windows, single room accommodation basically. The housework would be pretty minimal as far as cleaning the house goes, but A lot of photos taken in the snow. The ones of the snow around the entrance to the tunnel with the workers clearing it. And I can remember my mother being concerned every time she heard an avalanche coming down the hill. She would be sort of trembling and thinking, well, you know, where's that one going to hit, and is it going to hit anybody? My father was there to repair the trucks and what little machinery they did have. He was a blacksmith by trade, so he worked in the workshops at the tunnel and sharpened all the drill bits for the drillers who were drilling inside the tunnel. And he also used to drive the snowplough to clear the roads when they got snowed in.
Although the Homer saddle was solid granite, it still fractured and split, and freezing water steadily leaked into the tunnel. Because it's being dug downhill, the water pooled at the bottom where the men were drilling. It's constantly pumped out, but working conditions were dangerous, noisy, and very wet. The Homer tunnel was largely built by pick, shovel, and explosives. Power tools and machinery were starting to appear, but money was tight and manpower cheap. A Labour Party election campaign film in 1938 claimed it was slave labour.
Do you remember this? Back-breaking, low, tedious and insanely expensive.
Former West Coast miner and union organiser Robert Semple was Minister of Works in the Labour government. Nicknamed Bulldozer Bob, Semple promoted mechanisation as the salvation of the working man.
Here is the burden of toil transferred to the machines that cannot feel it. Man invents these ingenious machines. Why not use them?
Main roads were progressively upgraded with an all-weather surface of crushed stones, and gradually some were sealed with asphalt, the beginnings of the modern highways. There was plenty of work still to do, but New Zealand, coming out of the 1930s Great Depression, was clearly making progress.
And so the great Public Works Department, at half the cost and twice the speed, marches on.
At the Homer Tunnel on the Milford Road, there's great relief in 1940 when the mountain was finally pierced by a pilot hole. Water now drained by itself, making conditions for the workers much better, and the tunnel opened, unofficially, for foot traffic only. But just when the end was literally in sight, work was abandoned.
Second World War came along, and it was a manpower issue, of course, and so an awful lot of men volunteered for active service overseas. So the decision was made to actually close the project down until they closed it down indefinitely, because nobody actually knew whether we'd ever come back here.
The war in Europe and the Pacific stripped New Zealand of working men. Many of those who leave full of hope and determination don't come back. Many who do are not capable of working anymore. After the war, the Milford Road and Homer Tunnel projects were slowly restarted. The road was finally finished in 1952, and the tunnel opened 2 years later. The work camps were dismantled, the workers moved on. In their place came tourists.
The Homer Tunnel is just over 3/4 of a mile long, and the interesting thing is that it leads nowhere, except to a luxury hotel where people go to admire a view.
But the Milford Road wasn't quite the holiday highway the tourism films made out. Terry Gilligan, who ran a family transport business, knew it took no prisoners.
I had a truck and a contract to cart stores from Lumsden to Milford Sound. It was still a very rough road. To go from the Homer Tunnel to Milford, it would take me 2.5 hours. It was quite steep in parts, more than it is now. Bridges were still using old trees, and they creaked and groaned all the way. It was just a slow road. Coming out of the tunnel one day, it was black, and I thought, what bother? And it started to pour. The splashing would come up, and you could hardly see the road. You could see the white posts now and again. Thunder and lightning was unnerving. You'd be driving along, and all of a sudden there'd be a swish of light, and the lightning had hit the telephone line and it would burn it up for 3 or 4 miles. Avalanches were the biggest problem. One day I sensed there was something wrong, and you could hear it coming, and I stopped, and it appeared out of the fog and rolled across the road ahead of me. And it actually sledged the truck back 20 odd feet. I thought the windows were coming in, but no, she held together.
During World War II, road building and maintenance ground to a halt. So roads were in pretty poor shape when the fighting was finally over. There was more traffic, bigger and heavier trucks, and new cars that all found the old roads very tough going. The result was a frenzy of construction, expansion and improvement. Motorways started appearing. The first opened in Wellington in 1950. In Auckland, city and suburban traffic was a nightmare. Tram tracks were pulled up to make more room, and the first small part of the southern motorway opened in 1953.
2¼ miles of motorway already point to the cure for congestion at Auckland's southern outlet. At present it runs out from Penrose. In time it will loop direct from Newmarket.
There was a need to get a system that would allow a good deal of traffic to move fairly efficiently back and forth through Auckland, through into the North Shore, through down to the Bombay Hills, and of course the implication was that there would have to be some sort of connection across the Waitemata.
It's hard to imagine Auckland without its iconic bridge, but it took nearly 100 years of dreams and dashed ambitions to build. A harbour crossing was first suggested in the 1860s with plans for a pontoon. That came to nothing, and so did all the other plans in subsequent years. In the post-war boom, Auckland City was growing furiously, but the shore's still going nowhere.
It was Auckland's beach resort. Most of those were not sealed, and there were large areas of just nothing, countryside. It was damn old transport. I mean, the trip round the top of the harbour was ghastly. The only way access for a car was a very slow ferry. At the end of a Sunday afternoon, you would get queues. You might be in the queue for an hour or two just to get on the ferry back to Auckland.
Businessman Sir John Allen was elected Auckland City Mayor in 1941 and was a tireless campaigner for a harbour bridge. He supported one across to Northcote Point and constantly lobbied central government to pay for it. But Prime Minister Sidney Holland stalled for time. He knew that Auckland's more than 40 local councils couldn't agree on what they wanted.
So if you were dealing with Allen and Allen said, look, 2 or 3 local authorities around here badly want the bridge, you then had to deal with disputatious people, some of them on the shore, who said, hang on, what's being planned doesn't suit us, and others who keep saying, no, it's far too expensive, and besides, we think a tunnel would be better. And so you've got all sorts of argy-bargy endlessly.
There was opposition to the bridge. There was a lot of argument over where it should be, because wherever you're going to put it, you get the people complaining, I don't want it in my backyard. But it had to go in somebody's.
In the early 1950s, after nearly 100 years of debate and false starts, plans were finally firming up for an Auckland Harbour Bridge. The Auckland Harbour Bridge Authority, chaired by Auckland City Mayor Sir John Allen, has been formed to raise the money and approached the British government.
London was no longer the source of capital that it had once been. I mean, they'd come through the war, they were desperately short of money, impoverished really, and they didn't want to lend. So increasingly it became clear that the money would have to be raised locally. Eventually the government said, look, I know you would like $8 million, not on, too much. You'll have to do the whole thing for $5 million.
With the budget slashed, the bridge was redesigned. Vehicle lanes were cut from 5 to 4, pedestrian pathways were gone, so was the railway track. But in return, the government backed the loans and contracts were signed with an English consortium, including Dorman Long, the company that designed and built the Sydney Harbour Bridge.
One school of thought said it should be much bigger because once we open it, it's going to cause an explosion on the other side of the harbour, on the North Shore. Everybody will want to live there. As it turned out, they did. None of this was foreseen. It was never going to happen.
Work started in May 1955. The first job was construction of the giant abutments or anchorages at the northern and southern ends. It's thought the work will take 9 months. In the event, it's much more difficult. It takes nearly 2 years. The bridge was the biggest ongoing story in town, and reporter Garth Gilmore bent the rules to get the scoops.
I was assigned to cover it, and that's where I discovered these wonderful little bridge monkeys, the people that had come from overseas to build it. They're mostly English. They're a Pommy mob, and they followed bridges around the world. They were special. They fascinated me, and they're happy to talk as long as you're up there with them. They had no safety gear, nothing to stop them falling off except their own skill. I got quite good at climbing. I never told the Auckland Star hierarchy. I would probably have been fired. If you were going to fall off, there was nothing to stop you, nothing to save you. I just learned never to look down too much.
The steel girder sections of the superstructure were partially pre-assembled on the city side. Jim Watt worked for a firm that did the blast cleaning and primer painting.
Units were treated really just like sections of a Meccano. Sections were riveted together and hoisted up into place. There were cranes to swing the sections together. They were floated generally into position.
Sometimes it looked to me like this was a mission impossible. You'd have two pieces sticking out from either end, and you kept thinking, what on earth is holding this up?
Moving the huge centre span into position was a daring and difficult undertaking. The contractors had built the span on top of a completed section, and when it's ready, floated it off in the so-called pickerback operation.
The 580-foot span sits on a carrier section, which sits on two barges. Moving the steel giant is a delicate, dangerous business that keeps each engineer and workman on his toes.
The span was moved midstream adjacent to where it fitted in the bridge. But the wind picked up, and it was too risky to continue, so the span was moored for 2 days till the weather changed. Then, oh so carefully, it's positioned over the piers and on the outgoing tide, slowly eased into place. But the highlights are tempered by dark days as well. Industrial relations were often strained and strikes called. 3 workers died during construction. They're remembered by a memorial under the bridge at the northern end. In mid-1959, the bridge was finally finished. Just before the grand official opening ceremony, the public was invited across on foot.
We went as a family, strolled very excitedly all the way up to the top. Being able to stand on that structure and look out, it was all anticipation really of the time that we'd be able to bring our vehicles across.
It's a great day for Auckland. 100 years after the first plans were drawn, the harbour bridge is ready for opening. Such an occasion calls for celebration.
What I do remember was hopping into Mum's car with a whole group of friends and us charging up from the south side and doing a very quick U-ey and coming back down to the city again. 2 and 6pence, half a crown was the bridge toll, and we didn't want to part with that. That was worth a few beers.
So my memories are, of course, that everybody wanted to go over at once. It was a jam-packed mess.
On the Northern Freeway, motorists queue for 6 miles, waiting to cross the bridge for the first time.
It was hilarious. And it was the first evidence we had, of course, that the thing wasn't really going to be wide enough.
Well overcrowded is the recent harbour bridge, already carrying an average of 21,000 vehicles a day, a figure that wasn't supposed to be reached until 1977.
Less than 10 years after opening, the bridge was doubled in size. 4 extra lanes, 2 each side.
The Harbour Bridge Authority was able to put the clip-ons on in 1968-69. Of course, they became the Nippon clip-ons. Some resistance about using those outside lanes for some years. I remember a distinct feeling that the damn things might fall off. They're still there.
The clip-ons really are separate bridges anyway. The units, once they're welded up, The thrust is all back to the piers both ends, so you really have 3 bridges there.
A second harbour crossing is set to be a tunnel. Plans are on the drawing board. It has central government and Auckland Council backing, with construction to begin in 2020. Of course, there's debate and controversy. History repeats. Back in the 1960s, as motorway and highway construction increased, so did the road toll. To test new road safety ideas, transport authorities used a 100-mile stretch between Parirua and Wanganui.
Dips and rises in the road, which deceptively shorten view ahead for overtaking, have been marked with a solid white line to the left of the dotted centre line. Motorists who cross these solid lines are pulled up in a hurry.
Early microwave radar detectors were tested, and a way was found to figure out the safe speed to take any particular corner.
Sway and side thrust force the metal ball across the glass scale until safety limit is reached.
The so-called ball bank indicator was fitted to a test car, and on a closed road, it took a downhill corner too fast. The safe speed was determined and the bend signposted. Soon, many of the innovations of the Guinea Pig Highway were adopted nationwide. Throughout the 1960s, traffic on the Milford Road steadily increased. It was fast becoming a major tourism highway, except for the winter and early spring, when it's closed by the risk of avalanche and flooding.
In 1954, the Tourist Hotel Corporation started building a new hotel in Milford. At the time, it was a 5-star hotel, and that attracted a lot of overseas people to come in.
A cheery coach full speed south, joyfully looking forward to a happy tour.
From 1970s, early 70s on, the road just got busier and busier.
By the late 1970s, tourism demand was such that it's decided to keep the Milford Road open all year. This put a lot more pressure and responsibility on the Downer Construction Company that had the contract to maintain the road.
When they did the Homer Tunnel in the 30s, they'd lost staff there that were killed in avalanches. So it was nothing new, just that people had forgotten about it because that was in the 30s, and we got to the 80s and it happened again. Man running the operation with 20 years experience lost his life attempting to open it and bring out a convoy from Milford Sound.
Wayne witnessed the accident that killed his boss, Robert "Pop" Andrews. And his determination that such a tragedy never happened again drives the Milford Road Avalanche Control Program.
There's no history, so you were starting with a clean sheet, so it was a real baptism of fire trying to get a bit of a handle on it. We didn't have the instrumentation we have nowadays. It's real pioneer stuff, really. Pretty quickly you got a feel for when it was likely to avalanche.
The program now has 30 years of data, updated daily, assessing the risk of avalanches anywhere along the Milford Road. Sometimes, when conditions indicate an avalanche is imminent, the road is closed and the team launches a preemptive strike.
Inside the aircraft, the bombardier sits behind the pilot and you'll say, right, I'm ready to burn. He'll say, light it up. You pull the fuses, you visually make sure they are burning, and then it's out the door. We use big payloads of explosives here purely because the starting zones are large. So if we're going to get in there, we might as well give it a good hit. The scale of the avalancing here is so large, getting caught out is not an option.
For many people, the Milford Road and Homer Tunnel is a once-in-a-lifetime trip, the route through a landscape of epic proportions. But for those who know the road's heritage and have experienced its many moods over time, the feelings go a lot deeper.
There's so much history in the valley. Been there from an early age and watching the changes. I never thought when I first went with my dad in the truck to the Homer, 3 or 4 year old, that it would be as much of my life. Well, it's been my life.
One of New Zealand's first major construction projects was the road over Arthur's Pass between Canterbury and the west coast, built in the 1860s by men with pick and shovel. A good run on a stagecoach took a day and a half, but the road was poorly maintained. And once the railway went through, it's simply not a priority. However, with increased traffic over the years, there's demand for improvements, particularly on the perilous zigzag stretch in the Otira Gorge.
Basically, the zigzag road was on a scree slope and it constantly got undermined by wind and rain. By the very nature of the slope, it was unstable. There was a number of options. There were bridges and tunnels, and basically at the end of the day, the viaduct option was both the best from an engineering perspective and also from an environmental perspective.
Ambitious is the word that jumps at me. I mean, it's a big bridge. It's 45 metres high roughly and 440 odd metres long in a really challenging environment.
Uppermost in the design engineers' minds was the fact that this is one of the most earthquake-prone areas in the country.
There's 9 active faults within 50 kilometres and the main alpine faults are within 20 kilometres. So everything that was built here was built to take stresses 40% higher than any other bridge previously built.
Construction on the viaduct began in 1997, and there were difficulties right from the start.
Where the foundations were laid was very hard. It had to be very deep because we weren't founding in any bedrock, so the foundations were going to be a very costly item in themselves. So obviously the fewer foundations you put in made it easier to construct. That was why at that time it was one of the longest spans, the 134 metres that was ever put in New Zealand.
Building foundations for a bridge 25 metres deep into essentially a big rock slope with rocks from silt size or sand size up to 14, 15 metres across with water level at ground level, that's a massive challenge. The first 18 to 20 months of the job we're building the foundations, so you can see there's a lot going on site, but there's nothing above ground, and so there's lots of questions about, you know, what's going on.
The weather on site was unpredictable, to say the least, adding to the discomfort and danger.
The reality is that the annual rainfall at the site is probably somewhere between 5 and 8 metres a year. So often it was raining, and we're not just talking mist, we're talking, you know, real bucketing rain. Often it was windy, and in the winter it was perishingly cold. I mean, you have to be pretty hard to get out of bed and get into clothes that are probably still wet from the day before.
Once the foundations were finally in, work began on the superstructure, a finely tuned balancing act.
The central pier, that was about 25 metres high, and it's hollow with quite thick concrete walls. It might sound pretty solid, but if you built it, you got it there, and then you built all of that side out, it's just going to fall over. So no more bridge, essentially. So absolutely critical that, yeah, you build one section there, one section there, one section there, one section there, and keep it in balance. And in fact, once it got out to probably 55 metres either side, you couldn't actually balance it just with the next segment. So we needed to put concrete on one end to keep it balanced. So yeah, it was absolutely critical.
The Otira Viaduct took 22 months to complete at a cost of about $25 million. Understandably, when it opened, there's quite a party.
Well, the opening day was the 6th of November 1999.
Eddie and I formally declare the Otira Viaduct officially open.
We had the Kokotai Municipal Band playing, which is a very West Coast thing to do. And there were a lot of people there to actually walk the length of the bridge.
This is a once in a lifetime. From a New Zealand point of view, this is really great.
To see it finished successfully was just fantastic. I mean, I have a wee house at Arthur's Pass now, and every time I go up there, the kids say, oh, there's Dad's bridge, you know, so that's quite cool, and hopefully when they've got kids, it'll be Granddad's bridge.
These days, the interest in off-road cycling breathes life into old abandoned transport routes around the country. One of the most unusual is a cobblestone road in the classic Roman style, built early in the 20th century in the middle of nowhere. The old coach road runs along the lower slopes of Mount Ruapehu for about 15 kilometres from Ohakune to Horapito. It was built so construction materials could be hauled up to the massive Hapua Whenua rail viaduct and as a reliable, waterproof route for coach traffic.
In the days before tar seal, the very best you could do would be to build a stone paved surface. But they were really expensive, and so it wasn't done too often. You can see the surface is formed of closely fitted cobblestones to provide a convex surface that's hard and sheds the water.
The coach ride was part of a train trip through the North Island that took 3 days. It's early adventure tourism, and it left its mark, in more ways than one.
It wasn't all wonderful because of the paving. People remembered the bumps and the jolts on the hard surfaces. But there was wonderful scenery. There were the camps to call in by and drop off the mail, and people wanted to see the huge viaducts under construction. In fact, a feature of the journey was the lunchtime stop when the hampers came out and you sat down above the huge Makatoti viaduct and watched them putting all those pieces of steel together. So there was certainly plenty to tell your friends about when you got home.
The North Island main trunk line was finally connected in 1908, allowing trains to travel direct between Auckland and Wellington. The coach road was surplus to requirements, quickly abandoned and overgrown. But as it turned out, not forever.
The mana of the road has been restored. It had a role here enabling development of the area. It became forgotten, and suddenly we've discovered this neat place and put it back into use again.
These days we think of roading being the dominant form of transport in New Zealand. But for a large part of the 20th century, that wasn't the case.
In spite of other transport, railways are always the biggest hauler of produce.
The road transport industry was tightly regulated. For many years, trucks could only take freight a maximum of 30 miles. In 1977, that's increased to 150 kilometres. But the industry lobbied hard for complete deregulation and aggressively targeted its competition.
Even the railways depend heavily on private transport operators. The end of the line does not mean the end of a job. None have a better name than the heavy transport drivers, the knights of the road, and the transport industry aims to keep it that way.
By the mid-1980s, road transport was largely deregulated. Trucking companies expanded and new players set up. The effect on rail and coastal shipping was dramatic. Both industries lost business, and both started to decline. Successive governments decided roading was the way to go.
Construction of new roads, maintenance and streamlining of existing highways is a continual process, needing a steady supply of solid finance.
The money came from fuel tax, registrations and licence fees and road user charges. It's spent on roading projects determined by government priorities of the day. In the early 1960s, that was all about Auckland motorways.
To carry fast traffic into and through a city as big as Auckland's becoming, a vast and audacious motorway plan is necessary.
The plan to build a motorway through the central city looked visionary, but it led to the major congestion problems that still plague the city today. Part of the potential solution, also planned for many years, is a motorway right round the city. And the final link is the Waterview connection.
Waterview is our biggest land transport project of modern times. It's $1.5 to $2 billion, depending on what parts of the project you want to count. And it really is the key part to making the whole road networks work more effectively. It's two big tunnels, and there's a big tunnel boring machine that's going to make its way underneath those suburbs, and that will make a huge improvement to the connectivity between the south of Auckland and the airport, and where the other highways connect right around the Waitemata Harbour and back into the central business district. So it's an exciting project well underway.
Today, road expansion, especially motorways, is questioned on environmental and economic grounds. There are calls for more public transport and a move from trucks to more freight movement by rail and coastal shipping. But roads have played a huge part in making New Zealand, and Kiwis' love affair with them is strongly ingrained.
People that pioneered New Zealand had a tremendous drive. They had a tremendous willpower to get things done, to push ahead and to make the best of what they had. The engineering side of New Zealand's history, the transport side, the ability to construct things, the ability to take on the geography of the place. It was very much integral with New Zealand's self-image, an image of pioneering. There was an image of freedom, freedom to build a new society, a better society. So you think, well, actually we do have the edge. We've met some pretty tight challenges and beaten them. And I think that's something that New Zealanders need to be proud of.
Railways are sort of like the ultra-fast broadband and smartphones of that era.
The unique story of rail in New Zealand.
The ruggedness, the beautiful bush setting, and the engineering triumphs.
Local innovation.
It was all done by the horse and cart and just manpower.
That was world class.
It was described as the Eiffel Tower of viaduct.
There's no better way that this could be done even today.
All aboard for the new documentary series, Prime Presents, Making New Zealand, next Sunday.